Okay, real talk. Anyone else get, like, totally sticker shock last time they were at the pump?
Yeah.
It's like those prices are on fast forward or something.
Yeah.
It got me thinking, got to be more to it than just those carbon tax headlines we always hear about, right?
Oh, for sure. You're definitely onto something. It's easy to get caught up in the latest news, but the reality is, what drives prices at the pump is, well, it's a lot more complicated.
Well, that's what we're here for. Lucky for us, we're diving deep into all that. We've got this amazing analysis of Canadian fuel pricing going all the way back to 1990. So we're talking like 3 decades of data here. We're going to try to figure out what's really going on and how it affects you.
It's going to be a fascinating journey, that's for sure. But it all starts with understanding the anatomy of a gasoline price.
Okay, I like that. The anatomy. So let's unpack this a little. What are the core ingredients that go into that final price we see at the pump?
Well, you got your key players, right? First up, you've got the cost of crude oil itself.
Makes sense.
And that's often measured using something called WTI, which is basically a benchmark for crude oil prices, kind of like the gold standard, but for oil.
Okay.
So that's a big one.
So that's like the main ingredient, the base of our fuel price smoothie here. What else gets tossed in the blender?
All right, so next you've got what's called refinery margins. And essentially that represents the costs and profits for, well, refining that crude oil into the gasoline we use. So think of it as the cost of turning those raw ingredients into something you can actually put in your car.
Okay, so we're talking about like processing, turning that oil into something usable.
Exactly.
Then what?
Then you've got retail margins, which are the expenses and profits of those gas stations we all know and sometimes love.
Right.
And then, of course, their distribution costs, got to get the fuel from point A to point B, the refinery to the pumps, and, of course, taxes.
Yeah, gotta love those taxes. Always seem to find their way in there.
They do. They do. And in the case of gasoline, we're talking about a whole bunch of taxes. You've got your federal excise tax, GST, HST, provincial fuel taxes, and then, of course, the carbon tax everyone's talking about these days.
Right.
And if that's not enough, you even get some municipal taxes thrown in some areas.
Wow, so many taxes all wanting a piece.
They want their share.
Before we get into the history, though, I know we're going way back, but it's important to mention that not all provinces handle gas pricing the same way.
Oh, absolutely. That's true. While most of Canada uses that market-driven system where the prices fluctuate based on supply and demand, you've got a few provinces like Prince Edward Island and those in Atlantic Canada that have gone with regulated pricing instead.
Right, so it can get even more complex.
It's a whole other layer of complexity. For this deep dive, we're going to stick with the trends that are affecting the majority of Canadians, to keep things focused.
Gotcha, makes sense. But even with those different approaches to regulation, those core components, the basic anatomy of that price, that still applies across the board. But this deep dive, it goes beyond just listing them out. It's a journey. And I got to say, some of this stuff was pretty shocking. Like back in 1998, taxes made up almost 50% of the price of gas. Pretty striking when you see it like that, right? Especially when you think about how much things have changed. Today, that number is closer to 30%.
Okay, so not quite half anymore, but still a huge chunk of what we're paying. What's behind that shift? Why were taxes such a big deal back then?
Well, if we look at the data visualized in these charts, especially figures 3 and 4, you can see how the lines representing taxes and gas prices have sort of, well, they've danced around each other over the years.
I like that little tax and price tango.
Exactly. And like any good dance, there's a lot happening behind the scenes. A big factor is how these fixed tax rates interact with the constantly fluctuating price of crude oil. So even if the actual dollar amount of a tax stays the same, when crude oil prices go up, which they love to do, the percentage the tax represents within the total price goes down because it's all relative.
Exactly. It's a fascinating dynamic, and it all comes down to understanding the role of each of those taxes.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Speaking of taxes, let's zoom in on how they've each played a role in this whole gas price dance floor over the years. What can you tell us about these tax players?
Well, if we look back to the 90s, the federal excise tax was a pretty big deal back then.
Ah, the good old days, huh? When the excise tax was the star of the show.
Hmm.
But it seems like it's not so much anymore, right?
Yeah, its share of the total gas tax has definitely been going down.
So if the excise tax is fading out, what about those provincial fuel taxes? I noticed in the data, especially around 2019, they kind of took a dip. What's that all about?
You're right, provincial fuel taxes have gone down for sure, especially lately.
So with both the excise tax and provincial fuel taxes shrinking, what's filling the gap? Is
Yeah.
it GST, HST?
GST-HST has been pretty stable, actually. The one that's really changing the game here, the one everyone's talking about, is the carbon tax.
Yeah, that's the one you always hear about these days. And when I saw that chart, figure 6, I was pretty shocked. I'm not going to lie. It's gone from almost nothing to a major player.
Absolutely. From barely noticeable a decade ago to a major force in 2023, now it makes up a solid 26% of the total gas tax.
26%. That's more than a quarter of all the tax we pay on gas. Really shows how much carbon pricing is changing things.
Okay, so I gotta ask, are these increases actually hitting our wallets as hard as they seem? Like, inflation has been crazy, right? Are those numbers taking that into account?
You're totally right to bring that up. We can't just look at those raw dollar amounts, what those taxes were years ago versus now. We got to adjust for inflation to get a real sense of the impact. And that's where it gets interesting.
Okay, now you got me curious. Break it down. How has the real cost of those gas taxes changed once we factor in inflation? So while it's true those gas taxes have tripled in nominal terms since 1990, once you adjust for inflation, that increase is more like 35%.
Okay, so not quite triple the cost when you factor in inflation, but still, 35% is still a lot. Really shows you how important it is to look at the real value of money over time.
Exactly. And that's why those charts from the analysis are so helpful. Figure 7, the one comparing nominal and real gas tax, it's super insightful.
Yeah, it's like looking at two different worlds. You've got that nominal world where the numbers look scary, and then you adjust for inflation, and it's like, okay, it's still significant, but it gives you a more realistic picture.
Exactly. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, the total tax burden on gasoline has basically kept pace with rising prices over the last 3 decades.
So even though those price jumps at the pump are rough, once you account for inflation, that overall tax burden hasn't been as out of control as it might feel sometimes.
Exactly. But, and this is where it gets interesting, we need to talk about the future. Remember that carbon tax we were discussing? Well, it's on track to become the most important factor in gas taxes.
How dominant are we talking? Like, what are we looking at for Canadian drivers?
Well, the analysis suggests that by 2030, Canadians could be paying 52% of their total gas tax just from the carbon tax.
Whoa, 52%, that's over half. So in less than a decade, the carbon tax could be responsible for more than half the tax we pay at the pump.
That's what it looks like, based on the current trends. Really goes to show how much those carbon pricing policies are changing things.
It's crazy. And that's just one piece of the puzzle, right? What about all those other factors that could come into play? Like, what happens if some big global event sends oil prices through the roof?
Exactly. It's hard to predict those kinds of things, but they're definitely important. Imagine some big breakthrough in electric vehicle tech that makes them way more affordable. That could completely change how much gas people are using.
Right. It's like we're trying to predict the end of a movie after just watching the trailer. There are just too many unknowns when it comes to gas prices in the future.
And that's what makes it so interesting. We're not just talking about numbers, we're talking about how economics, policy, technology, all of it, even how people behave, it all plays a role.
So where does this leave regular people who need their cars to get around? What's the takeaway here?
Awareness, that's the key. When we understand those trends and how all the different parts of the price are changing, we're in a better position to handle whatever comes next.
So it's about being informed and being ready to adapt, because who knows what the future holds.
Exactly.
Well said. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into the world of gas prices in Canada. Hopefully you found this as interesting as we did. Until next time, stay curious out there.